Yarn. Yarn's ultimate Kilkenny City history walking tour. Hello, welcome to Kilkenny. My name is John Roach, and I'll be your guide for the next 90 minutes or so. I grew up in Kilkenny City. I lived right next to the GAA Stadium, and I went to school in the heart of the city. So I've spent half my life hanging around the streets and lanes around here. This is a long tour, but it's super extensive, and you can take it at your own pace. We'll have 15 stops. Just pause the podcast at the end of each stop and press play again when you reach the next stop. The total walking distance is about 2.7 kilometres. The longest distance between stops is 350 metres, but the average distance between stops is about 200 metres. Take as many breaks as you like, get a bite to eat or a pint anywhere along the way. Or even break the tour over multiple days if you like. Or do the route on your bike. It's bike friendly. If you don't mind a few steps here and there, do whatever suits you. You don't even have to be in Kilkenny. You can just listen to this as a podcast from wherever you are in the world currently. Use my illustrated guide. It's the first link in the description. There are images for each stop and the route is mapped. Be sure to have that open with you so you can find your way from stop to stop. Okay, we've got over 1,000 years of history to cover, so let's get started. Stop 1 is the steps of St. Canice's Cathedral in Irishtown. We're starting our tour here on the steps of St. Canice's Cathedral because this is, quite literally, the beginning of Kilkenny. Before there was a castle, before there was city walls, there was a man named Canice. Canice of Abbey, also known as St. Canice in Ireland and St. Kenneth in Scotland. St. Canice was one of the 12 Apostles of Ireland, a group of monks in the 6th century who travelled the country spreading Christianity. He came here from Ulster originally and chose this spot to establish a monastery. Why here? Well, for one, the local kingdom of Ossory wasn't exactly a Christian stronghold, so it was ripe for conversion. But, to be honest, it's also fantastic farmland around here. This very place gave our city its name. In Irish, it's Kilkenny, which means Church of Canice. If you look up at the magnificent round tower beside the cathedral, it was built in the 800s, hundreds of years after Canice was here. Canice actually lived until he was 84 or 85, so he had a long life for someone back then. The round tower is the oldest structure still standing in Kilkenny. When I was a kid, I used to touch the blocks on the very bottom of the tower and think, these are the oldest blocks laid on the oldest building in Kilkenny. I got a bit of a kick out of that. It's one of the only 3 round towers in Ireland that you could still walk up on top of. So if you want to break away right now and go up to the tower, go for it. It's an epic view. I'll still be here when you get back. Why was the tower built? Well, one word: Vikings. While the Vikings were busy raiding monasteries up and down the country, the monks here built this as a watchtower and a place of refuge. The door was about 10 feet above the ground, so they would run up there if any Vikings ever came and pull a ladder up after them. The Vikings, of course, eventually calmed down a bit and settled. They founded Ireland's first towns: Dublin, Waterford, Cork, Limerick and Wexford. All cities now, all on the coast. Kilkenny is the only inland city in Ireland, and I'll tell you why that is a bit later. It's never been documented if this tower was ever attacked by the Vikings, but the cave at Dunmore, about 11 kilometres from here, has a chilling story to tell. In the annals of Ireland, these were records and news and events written by monks from various monasteries around Ireland in the Middle Ages. The annals record that over 1,000 people were massacred in Dunmore caves by the Vikings. It's said that the Vikings from Dublin were en route to attack rival Vikings in Waterford. We're talking circa 928 AD. They raided the surrounding land and found that a large number of people, mainly women and children, were hiding in a cave in Dunmore. Archaeologists later found the skeletal remains of all these people, all crowded together in a chamber. It's pretty gruesome stuff. Back then, Ireland wasn't one country. We had the 4 province names we know today, but there was also dozens of smaller, shifting sub-kingdoms, like Meath, Breffni, and the one we're standing in right now, the Kingdom of Ossory. We think it was named after the tribe called the Osric that lived in this area. Osric means people of the deer. A lot of these old kingdom boundaries are now the boundaries for the Catholic diocese. There is still a Bishop of Ossory. He used to live right here just up those steps, but this is now a Protestant cathedral, and we'll get to why that is a bit later on our walk too. A man named Cromwell had a lot to do with it. To the south of us, on the other side of the city, you'll see the other great stone giant around here, the castle. These 2 towers, the cathedral and the castle, represent the 2 competing powers that built this city. Kilkenny isn't really one town, it's actually 3 separate wall towns that were once fierce rivals. There's a famous map maker called John Roke, no relation to me, but he made one of the best maps of Kilkenny city as it was with its walls in the medieval period. There's a picture of it in the guide. It'll give you a great sense of the city's historic layout. We are currently in Irishtown, which grew up around this cathedral, or monastery as it was back then, and we were outside the main city walls. To the south of us we have Hightown, or Englishtown, dominated by the castle, with High Street and Parliament Street, and the third, slightly later town is across the River Nore. It's Johnstown, which grew up around St. John's Monastery, giving us John Street, John's College and John's Bridge. The area was also home to a couple of other powerful monasteries, like the Black Abbey and St. Francis Abbey, which were centres of knowledge and learning. St. Francis Abbey would eventually become the original site of a very famous brewery, but more on that soon. So if you direct your attention to this sculpture in front of us, this is a sculpture of St. Canice. It's called Cianach, but us locals have a slightly more basic name for it. We call it Canice's Head, or just the Head, or Big Head. It was moved here in 2016 from its original spot on Parliament Street, and it had a water feature when it was there, but since they moved it, the water feature hasn't worked since. It was made by a Spanish sculptor, Saturio Alonso, in 1999. He's a long-time Kilkenny resident. He's actually married to my primary school teacher, and he used to come in sometimes and do art projects with us. Even though it doesn't work anymore, there was a good reason for the water feature. It was so you could see what the stone looked like when it was wet, if it wasn't already raining, which it usually is. Take a look a bit closer at it, you'll see that the polished stone is actually limestone, and it's why Kilkenny is known as the Marble City. Our early cobblestone streets were paved with this stone, and when it rained, the stone took on a black colour, and the whole city would gleam like black marble. The more polished it is, the more black it becomes, and the more obvious the fossilised bits and pieces you see in there become. So even though we're called the Marble City, it's not actually marble, it's limestone. That black colour, along with the amber you associate with the local brewing tradition, colour of beer, gives us our county colours, black and amber. Also, the monks of the nearby Black Abbey, which we'll see in a second, they wore black robes, further cementing the black and amber association. But this might just be retroactively applied, because I've also heard that the colours were purely chosen for the hurling team, and that their black and yellow striped jerseys were just picked out because they were going cheap and they needed jerseys fast, and then it just stuck. So Kilkenny is known as the medieval city, and as we covered, the Marble City, even though it's not marble. And we have another famous nickname, we're also called the Kilkenny Cats. There are 2 stories about where this comes from. First, there's a bit of a joke. It is said that there were 2 soldiers up on the city walls when we had walls. They were on watch duty, and they were bored, so they started betting on 2 cats that they saw fighting down below them. The cats fought so viciously, it's said, that they ate each other completely, leaving only their tails behind. So then the soldiers didn't know how to settle the bet. That's kind of just a legend, but the second, slightly more believable story is that it represents the 2 feuding town councils of Irishtown and Hightown. For centuries, these 2 areas were fierce rivals, constantly fighting, like cats, as they say, over land, borders, taxes, and just the general power of the area. Now we're about to walk inside the old city walls. We're going to enter Hightown through what was known as the Water Gate. The gate is long gone by now, but it was called that because a little stream passed under it. You'll actually see the original footprint of the gate as we walk past the new library on the left. If you look down, the exact borderline of the gate is marked on the ground with, of course, Kilkenny limestone. We'll cross this border, the site of the old gates. As a kid, I used to imagine myself actually travelling through a time portal each time I went through a gate or the site of a gate. There were 7 gates into the city, and I'll let you know whenever we cross a site of a gate. So let's all imagine as we pass through our first gate that we also jump forward in time from the 800s when the tower was constructed, and we'll pass into the 1300s, 500 years later. Any questions on any of that? I realise we are a bit spatially and temporally challenged at the moment, so asking questions is hard, I see that, but it's not impossible. If you have questions, drop them in as a Spotify or YouTube comment, and the future version of me will post a reply when I can. I love giving my future self work. You posting questions will help me update any future versions of this tour, so it will be much appreciated. Okay, our next stop will be the Abbey Quarter, the site of St. Francis Abbey. It's about 170 metres away and it's a 2-minute walk. Start walking southeast down Irishtown towards the Watergate Theatre / Abbey Quarter, and after the library, turn left. You can stop there. You can hit pause until you get there. If you're enjoying this podcast, please give it a rating on Spotify or Apple. Ratings really help, so I appreciate it. Thank you. Stop 2. Abbey Quarter and St. Francis Abbey. This whole area in front of us here is called the Abbey Quarter. This is where St. Francis Abbey and Monastery once stood, and it was the later site of the Smithwick's Brewery. It's a huge, big site. The brewery no longer exists, and this whole quarter is currently being redeveloped, or it was in 2025 when I recorded this. It's a little sad for me personally that the brewery is gone. I used to remember the distinct smell of hops being burned from the brewery. That sweet smell used to waft around the whole town at certain times, depending on where the wind was blowing. So I miss that smell, and I miss seeing the massive brewery tanks towering over this area. The ruins of the original Francis Abbey building are still there. You might see them beyond. If you look at a bottle of Kilkenny beer today, one of the brands of beers that was brewed here, you'll see that Abbey, St. Francis Abbey, depicted on the logo. Smithwick's is the most famous ale that was brewed here, of course. And the Smithwick's logo features a tower. I think it looks like one of the towers of the castle, though it has become more generic looking in recent designs, so I don't think it's meant to directly reference it. Smithwick's was first brewed in 1710, and they claim it is Ireland's oldest ale, so you can think of it as 10 past 5. I like to think about my drinks as actual times of the day. So at 10 past 5, 17:10 in the evening, you can drink a Smithwick's. And you still have time for your first Guinness at 1 minute to 6, 17:59. But you'll have to wait for the Angelus, of course, to finish before you take your first sip, if you believe the marketing. We all love Guinness marketing. In a second, we'll actually pass the entrance to the Smithwick's Experience. It's a museum you can visit now, if you'd like to see how Smithwick's was made and what the factory was like when it was open. But before that, I want to tell you about a monk who lived in St. Francis Abbey while we're here. His name was John Klyn. In 1349, the Black Death arrived in Kilkenny. And John kept a diary throughout the ordeal, like a 14th century COVID diary. They knew a little bit about the plague back then. They didn't exactly know where it came from. He kind of understood how the plague spread, at least. He wrote down that if you even touched the dead person, you were sure to die yourself. And his writings are devastating. He wrote of 10 of his fellow monks being buried in a single day. And as you read through his notes, things just get progressively worse as he describes what he sees and he describes the symptoms. And in his last entry is absolutely heartbreaking. He writes that his best friend has just died, and now he himself is waiting for death to take him. And he writes that he's leaving parchment behind in case anyone should survive to continue his work, so he left these blank pages. And then the writing just stops. It's very sad stuff, but it's amazing to have that first-hand account of what it was actually like. Again, if you have any questions on anything, drop them in the Spotify comments or YouTube comments. Our next stop will be the Ring, about 150 metres away, and it's about a 2-minute walk. And to get there, walk south down this lane until you reach the entrance of the Smithwick's Brewery experience with this distinctive red door. Stop 3. The Ring. This area here, with its circular footprint on the ground outside the entrance to the current Smithwick's Brewery experience, is known as the Ring. It's also known as the Bull Ring because it was where the rather gruesome sport of bull baiting took place. It was a huge spectator sport in the 1300s with lots of gambling. They'd tie a bull to a post, blow pepper up its nose, like to enrage it, and then set dogs on it. So it sounds horrible now. The people of Kilkenny loved it back then. And the man who organised all this lovely entertainment was known as the Mayor of the Bull Ring. And there was a whole committee called the Grand Council of the Bull Ring. They really wanted to protect this sport. The practice was popular for years, from the 1300s right up to the 1800s. The last recorded bull baiting spectacle in Kilkenny was 1837. And it wasn't here because they had moved it on from here, because the local merchants in town didn't like it being right on their doorstep, so they eventually kicked up enough of a fuss where it got moved outside the city walls, and it moved out to St James's Green, which we'll pass in a little bit. Our next stop will be the Blackfriars Gate, about 210 metres away, about a 3-minute walk. To get there, walk under the Ring Lanes Arch and onto Parliament Street, turn right, cross the road, turn left at the Pump House, that's a pub, and walk up the lane until you reach another arch, an old ruin of an arch. Stop 4. Blackfriars Gate. This is Blackfriars Gate. It's the only existing gate left in the city. It's a bit smaller than the other gates. This was actually just for pedestrians. It would have been built so the Dominican monks of the Black Abbey, so they could have easy access to the city, because their abbey was just outside the city walls. Hence it was named after the Blackfriars. It originally would have had a heavy-set wooden door, but the only thing left now is the arch of the doorway. The wooden doors would have been left open during the day and closed at night. There would have been guards posted at all the gates. I'm not sure about this one because it was kind of exclusive to the friars, but all the main gates would have had guards posted at them. I actually got to see what some of the old gates used to look like, and I got to pass through them for real. Back in 1992, the council built pretty convincing looking 1-to-1 scale versions of 4 or 5 of the gates in their original locations for the Kilkenny Confederation Festival. They even got soldiers from the local army barracks to dress up in period uniforms and guard the gates, but unfortunately they had to take the gates down again after the festival. All the motorists were relieved they got their roads back. As we walk through this gate, imagine we are travelling forward in time again, from the 1300s to the 1800s, so 500 years, specifically to 1864. Our next stop will be the Black Abbey, about 100 metres away, just a 1-minute walk. Walk on to the Black Abbey directly ahead. Stop 5. The Black Abbey. Welcome to 1864. The Black Abbey was actually formed in 1225, and back then it would have been a magnificent Gothic structure with a beautiful interior and elaborate stained glass windows. But if you were to come here in the early 1800s, this would have been just a ruin with no stained glass windows and not even a roof. Because in 1540, King Henry VIII's forces suppressed the Black Abbey as part of his dissolution of the monastery's policy. All the Dominican friars were forced to flee, and the abbey and its lands were confiscated by the crown. King Henry had his own new religion, and he was trying to get rid of Catholicism, so he shut down all the monasteries, basically. The abbey was converted into a courthouse after that. All religious iconography was destroyed, the stained glass windows being the most prominent form of Catholic imagery, so they would have been smashed and the lead would have been melted down. So for 300 years after that, the Black Abbey stood as a roofless ruin, exposed to the elements, and any remnants of its former glory would have crumbled away. The abbey wasn't restored to the Dominicans and re-roofed until the mid-1800s, when the monks were finally allowed to come back in the 1860s. The glorious stained glass windows you'll see are actually from the Victorian period, so they're relatively new by Kilkenny standards. The most spectacular window you'll see in there is called the Great East Window, but it's better known as the Rosary Window. It's one of the largest stained glass windows in Ireland. It has 5 magnificent lancets. These are the tall, narrow panels, and it has intricate tracery at the top. It was created by the renowned studio of Mayer & Co. of Munich, Germany, between 1891 and 1894. The Munich style was famous for its rich colours, painterly detail and dramatic compositions. The Rosary Window depicts the 15 traditional mysteries of the Rosary. You might be asking, what are the mysteries of the Rosary? Well, the mysteries of the Rosary are a series of meditations on key events in the life and death of Jesus Christ and his mother Mary. When a person prays the rosary with their rosary beads in their hands, they're supposed to be meditating on one mystery for each of the 5 decades, or tens, of the rosary beads. Each of the window scenes you'll see is packed with detail, so they're designed to be an object of deep contemplation. You're really supposed to look hard and contemplate as you look at the windows. As you're doing the rosary, I imagine, I don't know. I would encourage you to go in and have a look around. And our next stop will be St. Mary's Cathedral, about 250 metres away from here. It's a 4-minute walk. You can pause the podcast here, go inside and have a look, and I'll still be here when you get back. So when you're ready, we'll exit onto Black Mill Street, turn left, go up the hill, follow it around to St. Mary's Cathedral on your left, and stop at the corner right in front of it. Stop 6, St. Mary's Cathedral. To the left of us there is St. James's Green. If you remember from earlier, the bull baiting story, eventually after a lot of complaints from the city council, they moved the bull baiting to this square, probably because it was outside the city walls, so it wasn't so prominent. In a little bit we'll go back into the old wall city through St. James's Gate, named after this area. But first, right in front of us, is St. Mary's Cathedral. It's the Catholic cathedral. And as you can see, it's the tallest and most prominent building in the city. It's obvious someone was trying to make a point. It was built way after St. Canice's Cathedral and the castle. St. Mary's Cathedral was completed in 1857. So as we spoke about it back at the Black Abbey, in the 1500s, Henry VIII kicked out all the Catholic priests and monks from their monasteries. And what eventually followed was the widespread suppression of the Catholic Church in Ireland by the Crown, and the penal laws were enacted which restricted the rights of any Catholics. For example, they weren't allowed to own land, and the Catholic Church was forced underground for those years. Until, that is, Catholic emancipation, which started to roll back out in 1829, when all these restrictions were lifted, thanks in no small part to a Kerryman called Daniel O'Connell. And after the emancipation then, the Catholic community in Ireland were finally free to build prominent churches. They were back in power, and they wanted to show off. So, in the case of St. Mary's Cathedral here, the bishop in Kilkenny at the time, a guy called William Kinsella, he envisaged a grand structure that would assert the renewed dominance of the Catholic faith around this area. So he chose this commanding site up at the highest point of the city, deliberately creating a landmark to rival the medieval St. Canice's Cathedral, which by then was a Protestant cathedral, and Kilkenny Castle. He wanted to show that he was the big boy now. The church was designed by an architect called William Dean Butler from Dublin. When I first heard his name was Butler, I wondered, but he's no relation to the famous local Butler family from around here that we'll hear about a lot more later. What do you think? It's an immense towering Gothic style structure, built with what type of stone do you think? Yes, Kilkenny limestone again, which at this point the Kilkenny limestone was becoming quite exotic and sought after, so using it for the whole building is another statement of wealth and bravado, I think, but also pride in the local area. They wanted Kilkenny's most important building to be made out of the city's most important export. The first stone of this building was laid in 1843, and around about the same time as the first reports of blight started to strike Ireland's potato crop. You probably all know what happened next. The blight spread across the whole country and resulted in the Great Famine, or the Great Hunger, and it stretched from 1845 to 1857. It's estimated that by the end of the famine, 1 million people had died and another 1 million people had emigrated. So they had started building this building. What do you think happened to the construction of this, which would have been a massively expensive project? Did the bishop hold off on the construction? Maybe use the funds to help feed the starving while they were in this great famine? Well, no, he didn't. Despite the immense financial strain and the surrounding suffering everywhere, fundraising and construction pushed ahead. The church argued that the construction itself was a form of famine relief. The project provided steady wages for hundreds of skilled stonemasons, artisans and labourers who would have otherwise had no income to feed their families. They were paid for their work, so they got to maintain their dignity in a time of immense hardship. That was their story anyway. This kind of thing happened throughout the country. Construction projects were kicked off to help, in inverted commas, the poor. If a landlord needed a stable or a barn built, that was the time to do it. Some landlords just built things for the sake of it, even, to give people work. Garden decorations called follies, as an example. These are just buildings with no real purpose. Anything to just keep people busy. So that was the bishop's argument for the church's construction during this pretty much a state of emergency. But there's also an argument that the labour was obviously much cheaper and labourers were easier to come by because the people were desperate. And I'm guessing the bishop wasn't paying his labourers any more than he had to. But that's just cynic in me, of course. The architect, by the way, William Dean Butler, he actually died the same year as the cathedral was completed, 1857. Now, I would suggest having a quick pint in a pub before we move on, but I'll leave it to you. Our next stop will be Kyteler's Inn, about 300 metres away, so it's about a 3-minute walk. We'll head northeast on James's Street, down the hill to High Street. We'll have gone through the old site of James's Gate, and we'll be back inside the city walls. Then take a quick right on High Street, cross over the street, go down the market slip through the arch, and at the end of the steps, at the bottom of the lane, will be a stone building called Kyteler's Inn. Stop 7. Kyteler's Inn. So here we are inside the city walls again. You'll have noticed we nipped down one of the many slips or alleys in the city. The one we came down was the market slip. It's called that because most of these slips were lined with markets. A lot of them are connected. You can walk an alternative route the full length of Hightown from Patrick Street down to Irishtown using only lanes and slips. It was handy for us when we were teenagers skipping school. You can avoid the main street so no one would see you. The most famous of all these lanes is the butter slip, where butter merchants would set up stalls in the cool shade. We'll pass through that one shortly. Another alley off High Street is called Collier's Lane, where merchants would sell, what do you think? Yes, coal. Speaking of merchants, Kilkenny was famous for its merchant class and its powerful medieval merchant families. There are the so-called 10 civic families of Kilkenny, dating from the 300s onwards. This top 10 is not a 100% agreed upon list, much like who was in the Brat Pack, I imagine. But generally, the families are the Archers, I'll mention them a bit later, the Cowleys, the Lawlesses, the Leys, the Raggets, that's still a pretty common name around here. The Shees, we'll see their handiwork in a bit, they were involved in the brewing trade. The Shermans, the Rotes, we'll see their house later, and they were big wine importers. The Langtons, you might have already seen that name around the place. And the Kytelers. This stone building in front of us is Kyteler's Inn, and it's been a pub since 1639, but long before that, in 1324, it was the home to the Kyteler family, and its most famous inhabitant was a woman named Dame Alice Kyteler. 1324 was a dark time for Ireland. The devastating war with the Scots had just ended, leaving the country scarred and impoverished. It was a decade before the Black Death would arrive to make things even worse, and years before the powerful Butler family would buy the castle that looms over the city. We'll talk about them a bit more later. Kilkenny itself was a city on a knife edge, split into two rival towers, as we said before. There was Irishtown, huddled around the Cathedral and ruled by the Bishop of Ossory, as we saw before, and then inside the walls was Hightown, the English settlement of merchants and lords governed by their own council. In the heart of Hightown lived Dame Alice Kyteler. She was everything the locals weren't. She was foreign, fabulously wealthy, and unapologetically successful. Her family were merchants from Flanders, like many of the settlers who'd made Kilkenny their home. But Alice's success was shadowed by suspicion. Her first husband, the rich merchant William Outlaw, had died, leaving her his fortune and his two children, William and Rose. She went on to marry a second time, and her second husband was a moneylender named Adam LeBlund, and he also died, leaving his inheritance not to his own children, but to Alice's son, William. The townspeople smelt a rat, and there was growing resentment among them, so they convinced the council to make a raid on young William's house, where they found an astonishing amount of money hidden away. But even after two husbands had died, Alice was still quite wealthy. She was still considered quite a catch. So she married for a third time, this time to a guy called Richard Devay. And what do you think happened? He also passed away, and Alice had to fight his family in court just to get her legal widow's third of his estate. So that's 3 dead husbands. What did she do? Well, she married a fourth man called John Lepoire, her fourth husband. And in 1324, he became gravely ill. For the townspeople who'd been watching all of this go on, the pattern was becoming clear here. This had to be more than bad luck, surely. This whole situation was a powder keg, and into it, let's throw a match. Enter Bishop Richard Le Dread, the new Bishop of Ossory in Irishtown. He was appointed in 1317. He was an outsider from France, pretty much unknown in Ireland, and utterly unlike the previous bishop. The previous bishop had famously fathered 14 daughters, and was known for being quite corrupt. Le Dread was appointed to clean house, so to say. He was a total zealot, determined to stamp out corruption. He cracked down on his fellow clergymen. He banned them from having sex. He banned them from singing secular songs. And he banned them from insulting the church in any way he thought. And he also ordered them to be on the lookout for heretics. When the children of Alice's dead husbands brought a case against her, accusing her of profiting from their father's deaths, it was a simple financial dispute. Well, maybe murder was involved as well, but they were more concerned with the finances. The bishop saw it a little differently. To him, this was no mere inheritance squabble. He had heard all about Alice, and he was listening to all the gossip going on around the town. He had judged that her behaviour was witchcraft. So he accused Alice of being a witch and of worshipping the devil. And he didn't just accuse her, he accused her whole inner circle, 12 people in total, all stood accused of heresy. But of course Alice was no simple merchant's widow, she had super powerful friends. Chief among them was the brother of her current and former husbands. Her ailing husband John's brother was called Arnold de Puer, and he was the Steward of Kilkenny, the most powerful man in the Hightown Council, kind of like the arch nemesis of Bishop Ledred. And not only that, her first husband's brother also was called Roger Outlaw, and he was the Chancellor of the whole of Ireland. Ledred, he issued a warrant for the arrest of Alice and her son William, and sent it to the Chancellor of Ireland for signing. He didn't know who the Chancellor's brother was, of course. He had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The Chancellor was, of course, Roger Outlaw, Alice's former brother-in-law, and William's uncle, Alice's son. The warrant backfired. Arnold, the effective Lord of Hightown, the Steward of Kilkenny, he confronted the bishop and told him to back off, leave them alone. But Ledred wouldn't let it go, he was obsessed. So Arnold de Puer, the Steward of Kilkenny, had his men seize the Bishop of Ossory and throw him in the dungeons of Kilkenny Castle. The secular power of Hightown had imprisoned the spiritual power of Irishtown. So what did Ledred do? Well, in response, he unleashed his own ultimate weapon. From his cell, he placed the entire diocese under an interdict. He essentially ordered the church go on strike. So what happens then is no babies are allowed to be baptised, no confessions are allowed to be given, so no sins are forgiven. No funerals can be performed, so there's no blessing when people are buried, and no communions were allowed. This absolutely terrified ordinary people, because they thought they would literally go to hell if they couldn't get God's blessings or they couldn't get their sins forgiven. After 18 days of this, the public pressure was too much. Le Puer offered the bishop bail, but Ledred refused. He was determined to be seen as a martyr. They were forced to release him, and when he was released, his clergy brought him his finest robes, and he walked in a triumphant procession through the streets, down what we would call the medieval mile now, back to his cathedral, with the whole city folk lining the streets. I imagine it was something like that, like a scene out of Game of Thrones. Meanwhile, of course, this whole thing was about Alice Kyteler, so what happened to her? Well, she had a fair idea this was going south. So, knowing her local protection was gone, she fled to Dublin. But Ledred followed the case there, appealing to the king's chief man in Ireland, the Justicer, who supported him. He finally found a way around Alice's people. So Arnold de Puer was forced to make a public apology to the bishop. The jig was up, the game was over. An order for Alice's arrest was sent from Dublin, but she was already gone. She fled Ireland and she was never seen again. But with Alice gone, and remember he had accused 12 people, so he had turned his fury on those left behind. 8 women and 4 men. They were arrested. Alice's son, William, was given a relatively light sentence. He was forced to attend Mass every day for a year, and he had to pay for a new roof for St. Canice's Cathedral. Funnily enough, though, in a final act of irony, the roof collapsed a few years later. He got off relatively easy because he had enough money to get out of the situation. But for Alice's servant, Petronella de Meath, there was no mercy. She had no money. It's said that Ledred personally tortured her until she confessed to all the wild accusations that he put to her about witchcraft and worshipping the devil. And then, unfortunately, Petronella was burned at the stake, likely at the Tholsel. It's a site we'll pass in a second, actually, after this. It was Kilkenny's public meeting place. Petronella became the first person in Ireland executed for heresy. She might have even been the only person. There are no other documented cases in Ireland. But throughout the rest of Europe, there were thousands of people executed for heresy. We think we can't be sure, but estimates range from 3,000 to 5,000. And what do you think the vast majority of these people had in common? Yes, they were mostly women. So Dame Alice Kyteler was never seen again, but what do you think happened to Ledred? Well, Ledred's zeal and his prickly character eventually made him too many powerful enemies, and he too was forced to flee Ireland for a time. but he did return to Ireland in his old age. He's another character who lived to a really old age for the time. He lived until his 80s as well, like St. Canice. I imagine he kept a bit of a lower profile when he came back to Ireland the second time. It's a really dark story, but I always think it's interesting to think about where our image of the witch comes from. When you think in your mind, what does a witch look like? It's quite distinct, right? In the Middle Ages, many brewers at the time were women. They were often widows. That's how they could make extra money. They were known as alewives, and they'd stand in those lanes, probably like the ones that we passed down, and they would hand out ale to people that they had brewed themselves. How they advertised who they were was that they'd wear tall, pointy hats. And of course their beer they used to brew in cauldrons. And of course they kept cats to keep mice away from their grain. And of course they used a broom to keep a clean workplace. So a woman with a pointy hat, a cauldron, a cat and a broom, that's exactly what you think of when you think of a witch, no? If anyone has any questions on any of that stuff, throw it in the comments and my future self will try and answer it. Our next stop will be the Tholsel, or Town Hall. It's about 180 metres away, 2.5 minutes walk. But as we're down here on Kieran Street, feel free to stop somewhere for a bite to eat if you want. There are a few options around here, including Kyteler's Inn itself. So whenever you're ready, walk southeast down Kieran Street until you reach the steps of the Butter Slip. Well, they'll be on your right. Walk up the lane and join High Street. Turn left and in front of you will be the Tholsel. It's another stone building with a clock tower. Walk under the sheltered arcade and I'll meet you there. Stop 8. The Tholsel. As we pass through the Butter Slip there, you might have noticed a restaurant called Petronella's, named of course after Dame Alice Kyteler's unfortunate servant. It's believed she was burned at the stake in this very location. This exact building wasn't here then. There was a previous version of this building, but it performed the same purpose. It's where taxes, tolls and customs were paid. The name Tholsel or Tholsel comes from two Old English words, toll meaning tax or levy and seal meaning hall. Essentially it's a toll hall, but it performed other functions too. It was for public gatherings or proclamations. Actually, Eamon de Valera gave a speech here at the start of the War of Independence in 1921. But its most infamous use was for public punishments, including Petronella's execution. Over the years it was also used as a meeting place for the city council, and at one point it was a courthouse. Seems like all the buildings at Kilkenny were at one point a courthouse, I think. This current building dates back to 1768, but this also had to be renovated recently enough after a major fire in 1985. You can see the Kilkenny City crest on the south wall carved in stone. Our next stop will be Mary's Lane. It's about 100 metres away from here. It's a very short 1-minute walk. To get there, walk south on High Street for 50 metres, turn left onto Mary's Lane and follow it along until the lane opens up and you can see another old stone building on the right. Stop 9. Mary's Lane. As we walked up the lane there, hopefully you noticed the beautiful cartoon mural wrapped around the wall on the left. If it's still there, I'm recording this in 2025, so it might be gone. It features the characters from the animated films made by the Cartoon Saloon. Cartoon Saloon is a 5-time Academy Award nominated animation studio, and they're based right here in Kilkenny. They were established in 1999. I actually did a work experience one summer in their original studio when I was a teenager. They've now grown quite a bit and they have a couple of studios in the city. My favourite of their feature films is called Wolfwalkers. It's set in Kilkenny in the 1600s during Cromwell's takeover of the city. We also pass the entrance to the first St Mary's Church in Kilkenny. It's much older than St Mary's Cathedral. It's a bit more modest in size and location, hidden within the old city walls here. It dates right back to the year 1205, and it was established by a guy called William Marshall, aka the Earl of Pembroke, aka the Lord of Leinster. He's the same guy who built the current Kilkenny Castle, but we'll go into that in much more detail in a little bit. For centuries, Mary's Church was the principal church for the wealthy merchant families of Hightown, the English part of Kilkenny. It served not just as a place of worship, but also as a town hall and a treasury, and of course, a courthouse at one time. But after the Reformation, the church fell into a long period of decline and ruin. St Mary's Church is most famous for its incredible collection of medieval tombs and graves. If you were part of a rich merchant family in Kilkenny, you wanted to be buried here. It was a symbol of your status and importance. So if you go in now and look at some of the names on the graves, you'll see some of the Big Ten families, including the Shees and the Rotes, because they were competing with each other to commission the most elaborate burial monuments, so they could show off. The church is now a museum called the Medieval Mile Museum, so if you want, you can go in there now, check out its exhibitions and its tombs, or just go and look at the exterior graveyard, that's free, and see how many of the Big Ten Kilkenny families you can recognise. The name Medieval Mile, by the way, you might have heard it a few times since you've been here. This is a relatively new term, it's a marketing term, like the Wild Atlantic Way or the Ancient East. The Medieval Mile refers to the distance between the castle and St Canice's Cathedral. On the right here, this stone building is the back of the Shee Arms House. We'll pass the front on the way up to the castle. Why do you think it's called the Shee Arms House? Yes, it has something to do with the Shee family that we mentioned before. This almshouse was founded in 1582 by Sir Richard Shee. He was a wealthy and powerful merchant, a member of the Shee family, one of Kilkenny's 10 civic families. Sir Richard was a devout Catholic and he built the almshouse as an act of charity. That's a common practice for wealthy individuals at the time, so they could secure their place in the afterlife. Kind of like Bill Gates trying to give away his money. The building was specifically designed to house 12, in inverted commas, poor, deserving men and women of the city. I'm not exactly sure what the deserving meant. After Richard died, he left instructions in his will and funds for the almshouse's perpetual maintenance, and it was supposed to be managed by his heirs forever. The building is a beautifully preserved example of an Elizabethan Tudor almshouse. It was constructed with local limestone and features a chapel in the centre, with separate accommodation wings on either side for the residents. A plaque on the front of the building still bears the Shee family coat of arms, which you'll see on the other side of the road as we pass it. For over a century, the Shee family upheld their ancestors' wishes. However, after the Williamite Wars in the late 17th century, the family lost much of their land and power, and the almshouse fell into disrepair. I guess they had other things to worry about. Over the next few centuries, it served various purposes, including a hospital and a shop, before falling into near ruin. In the 1970s, though, the building was saved from demolition and meticulously restored to its former glory by the Kilkenny Corporation. Most recently, the building served as the Kilkenny Tourist Information Office. In one of the rooms inside, they used to have a beautiful scale model of the town, as it was in the 1300s. But I think that's gone now, and I'm not sure where it ended up. I loved it when I was a kid, so it's a real pity to see it gone. Our next stop would be Bateman Quay, right next to John's Bridge. It's about 150 metres away, about a 2-minute walk. So we're going to walk straight ahead down this lane, take the steps down to where Kieran Street joins Rosin Street, and then we'll continue northeast up to John's Bridge, and just before it we'll turn left down Bateman Quay, follow along the river, which will be on our right, and we'll find a spot on the grassy riverbank. Near the pedestrian bridge is good, because it'll give you a good view of the castle. Just a quick message, if you are enjoying this, it'd be super helpful if you rate the podcast in Spotify or iTunes, wherever you're listening. Stop 10. Bateman Quay. Okay, finally, our first proper view of Kilkenny Castle. We're now beside the River Nore. The river is beautiful, but it can be destructive. There were massive floods in 1763 and again in 1943. In 1763, the flood was so bad, it destroyed both the city's 2 bridges. Today, Kilkenny has 5 bridges. John's Quay over there on the other side of the river used to constantly flood in my childhood. I remember because the library is over there, and I always remember it being closed because it's to dry out books. That's what my mother said anyway, when I was asking to go. The OPW and the Kilkenny County Council finally fixed the problem in the 2000s with the flood relief scheme, and there hasn't been a flood since. Now, if you look across the river, the grey building across there is the Butler Gallery. The gallery was founded in 1943 and used to be in the basement of the castle. It moved to this location a few years ago. That building was Evans's home, an 1800s almshouse for impoverished servants, which they completely gutted and renovated, and now it's the gallery. And just over there to the north, on the other side of the river, or to the left of the Butler Gallery, is the War Memorial for World War One. It lists all the Kilkenny men in World War One, and my grandfather's name is actually on it, although they managed to spell his name incorrectly. Standing here by the river is the perfect place to talk about how the Normans ended up in Kilkenny in the first place. Well, in the 1100s, the kings of Ireland, they were always fighting. The king of Leinster, a guy named Diarmid, got into a huge feud with the guy called Tiernan, and he was the king of Breffni, which is like in today's region where Cavan and Leitrim are. Diarmid had a real chip on his shoulder and a lot of ambition. He wanted to be the high king of the whole of Ireland, and he was a constant nuisance to Tiernan. Him and his men were constantly stealing his cattle or raiding his villages. But the final straw was when Diarmid and his men abducted Tiernan's wife, Dervla. So what did Tiernan do? Well, Tiernan allied with the other kings, and they marched on Leinster, Diarmid's kingdom, and kicked him out. Then they took his kingdom for themselves. So what does a deposed Irish king do? Well, he sailed to France to find the King of England, who was there at the time, Henry II, and he asked him for help. The King of England ruled over France at the time as well, so that's why he was there. Henry meets him, but he doesn't want to get involved directly himself, but he gives Diarmid permission to recruit some of his Norman lords. These were his elite fighter knights. So Diarmid heads to Wales to find one of his best fighters, this guy called Richard de Clare, at his home in Pembroke Castle. De Clare is a powerful and really ambitious knight, and his nickname is Strongbow. You might have heard of that. King Henry was actually kind of glad to get rid of Strongbow because he was afraid of his ambition. So Diarmid goes and meets Strongbow, and he makes him an offer he can't refuse. If Strongbow helps him win back his kingdom, he can marry his daughter Aoife and inherit the entire kingdom of Leinster when Diarmid dies. So in 1169, the Normans landed in Ireland, a tiny force to start with, in Wexford. They had knights, archers and cavalry. The native Irish people saw these guys on armoured horses, and that was like tanks to them, so it didn't take many of them to make an impact. They took Wexford, then Dublin, and soon they were in control of the whole of Leinster. Diarmid then died shortly after, and true to his word, Strongbow married Aoife and became the king of Leinster. And one of the first things Strongbow did is that he built a wooden Mott and Bailey castle right here in Kilkenny, because it was the capital of Ossory, on the very site where the stone castle stands today. You can see it up there. This was in 1172. But like we said, King Henry II was a little nervous of Strongbow, and Strongbow was becoming way more powerful. He had lots of land in Ireland now, so he came over himself with a larger army to establish his own authority. And so the Norman conquest of Ireland truly began. The Normans established walled towns and gave plots of land called burgher plots to loyal merchants and tradespeople, so families could grow their own food. These plots were long and thin, and they used to run from High Street all the way down to the river here. You can get a sense of how long they were by looking over at where the red brick building of Dunstores is today. That distance down to the river was one plot, and there's actually only one of these original plots remaining intact in the city. And we'll see where it is later, over at Roath House. Okay, our next stop is the Rose Garden of Kilkenny Castle. It's about 400 metres away. It's a 5-minute walk. Walk south on Bateman Quay back towards where we were in John's Bridge. turn right onto Rose Inn Street, past the front of the She Almshouse, turn left onto the parade, go up the steps and hug the wall on the left, then turn left into the doorway into the castle garden. Go up the steps and walk ahead until you get to the viewing area in the corner of the castle. Stop 11. Rose Garden at Kilkenny Castle. Here we are at the magnificent Kilkenny Castle, up close. Strongbow built the first wooden fort on this site, but the stone castle you see today was built by his son-in-law, one of the most famous knights in European history. His name was William Marshal. Marshal was the ultimate superstar knight. He was a mercenary. He fought in the Crusades and he was supposedly unbeatable in jousting tournaments. He was so good that he became the Marshal to the king. Norman names are essentially their jobs sometimes. The king rewarded his loyalty by arranging his marriage to Isabel de Clare, who was the daughter of Strongbow and Aoife. He was in his 40s at the time and she was just 17. But that wasn't weird back then. And through her he became the Lord of Leinster and one of the wealthiest men in the world. He built the castle you see now in 1210 and developed a lot of the city's infrastructure and amenities, including the original Mary's Church, which we saw. He was doing this to convince Norman settlers to come here and build a prosperous town. The castle originally had 4 towers and a thick curtain wall, designed for defence, not comfort. The castle was a symbol of Norman power. This is a classic Norman design you see here, with a large courtyard, similar to Dublin Castle and Limerick Castle. And Isabel, his wife, was no damsel in distress because it was her family that was so powerful. She was kind of the boss, especially when William wasn't around. One time William was away and she was pregnant at the time. The castle was besieged. She personally organised the knights, rallied the defence, and even sent a man over the wall at night to get help. When reinforcements finally arrived, she wanted to hang the captured attackers from the walls as a message. William was a bit more political, so he let them go. The Rose Garden here is beautiful. It's a very popular spot for locals to chill out during their lunch. If you look at the layout of the garden from above, it looks like a Celtic cross. At the centre of the garden, there's a fountain. I used to love throwing coins in there when I was a kid and making wishes, of course. If you look out over the river, you'll be looking northeast. You can see why this is an amazing location for the castle, up at this height. And you can see the third walled town of Kilkenny, Johnstown. At its centre was John's Monastery, which became John's College, a fancy private school. Jonathan Swift was probably its most famous student. He wrote Gulliver's Travels. The school has since moved locations and names. It's now called Kilkenny College, and it's over the other side of the city. The old Kilkenny College building is now the Kilkenny County Council offices. Our next stop is just around the other side of the castle, about 160 metres away. It's a 2-minute walk. Walk around to the back of the castle into the park. Stop 12. Kilkenny Castle, Parkside. The Marshal family didn't last long here, relatively speaking anyway, and eventually the castle was bought by the most powerful family in Kilkenny's history, the Butlers. They bought the castle in 1392 and owned it for over 550 years. They finally sold it to the citizens of Kilkenny in 1967 for the symbolic price of £50. And oddly enough, Mick Jagger was here for the handing over ceremony. The last butler male died in America in 1997, and he had no heirs. And like a lot of powerful Norman families, the Butler family changed their name to match their job. A guy called Theobald Fitzwalter was a friend of the king, King Henry II. The king appointed Fitzwalter as the chief butler of Ireland. This was in 1185. The butler of Ireland was a high-ranking official in a noble court, responsible for the wine cellar and for serving the king or lord wine at important banquets. The word butler itself comes from the old French boutelier, meaning bottle bearer. That's the symbolic role, but really more importantly, the butler got to levy tax on all the wine imported into Ireland, which was basically a license to print money. Any bottle of wine that came into Ireland, he got a piece of. So Theobald Fitzwalter eventually changed his name to Butler to show off that he had this important job. And a big title came with the job as well, and the family title was they were called the Earls of Ormond. We think that the word Ormond comes from the Irish Or Muhin, which translates as East Munster. So all around the city you'll see different names associated with the area over years. Ossory, the ancient name for the area and the Catholic diocese. Pembroke, named after the Earl of Pembroke, from Pembroke in Wales, that's Strongbow's family. And Ormond, the Butler family's title. This side of the castle was originally where the main entrance was, and there was a long dramatic driveway stretching all the way down the centre of what's now the park. And that road led down to an area called Gallows Hill. And I think you can imagine what they used to do there. You remember I described the classic Norman castle with its inner courtyard, and you'll notice there's something missing around here. Yeah, there's an entire wall of the castle. The courtyard is open. This was heavily damaged during a siege conducted by a guy, you might have guessed it, called Oliver Cromwell. We will get to him in a little bit. So the wall was destroyed after that siege, and then the butlers later removed the damaged wall completely to get a better view of their magnificent gardens. So this park, the Castle Park, is now the heart of the city. There's a playground down there and there's an artificial lake down in the forest area. The butlers even have their own graveyard in the forest. As a kid I used to like going down there because there's a beautiful grave for a dog in there. It has an image of the dog carved into the headstone. I think his name was Sandy. If you want, now you can head inside the castle. It has some beautifully restored rooms, the most famous being the picture gallery, or long room we used to call it. It has loads of portraits of the butlers and has an amazing hand-painted roof. And then when you're ready, our next stop will be the Design Centre, and it's only 110 metres away, 2 minutes walk. Walk out the Castle Park gates near the Parade Tower and cross the Parade Street and walk into the courtyard of the Design Centre. Stop 13, Design Centre. This beautiful collection of stone buildings was the castle's stables and servants' quarters. There's an underground tunnel that goes from here, under the road, into the castle kitchens, because the lords and ladies didn't want to see servants running back and forth. It's been closed to the public as long as I've been alive, but I'd love to see it. In the 60s, this building here was home to the famous Kilkenny Design Workshops. The Kilkenny Design Workshops, or KDW, was a groundbreaking state-sponsored design agency established in 1963 to revolutionise and modernise Irish craft and design. The Kilkenny Design Workshops brought together talented designers from Ireland and all across Europe. And they worked with a wide range of materials like silver and metalwork, and they did ceramics and pottery, and they did textiles and weaving. But they also did furniture design, they did graphic design and industrial design and lots of print design. It had an immense influence. It introduced modern Scandinavian style design principles to Ireland, and it transformed the look of everything from household goods to corporate branding. I actually studied graphic design in college, and I wrote my thesis about Kilkenny design workshops. The workshops design the logos and branding for some of the biggest state-run companies and agencies, including the Post and Telegraph, Telecom Éireann, if you remember that, An Post, Irish Steel, and loads more. A lot of them have gone private since, so you see less of their logos around these days. At the time when I was in college, I got to interview a couple of the original designers. They still had an office here, but the Kilkenny Design Workshops, as a state-run entity, was long closed. It closed back in 1988, but they were kind of still just hanging around with their own private agencies. You can cut through the Design Centre courtyard and enter the back garden to Butler House. It's an elegant Georgian house owned by the Butlers. It was built as a dower house. This was a house built for the widow of the Earl, so she had a place to live when her son inherited the main castle. One of Butler House's most famous residents was a woman called Eleanor Charlotte Butler. In the late 1700s, she and her very dear friend Sarah Ponsonby from Woodstock, a big house outside the city in County Kilkenny, they were bookish young women and they refused to marry. Quite strong characters, I imagine. They met at a ball and then they became inseparable. They eventually ran away together to Wales, so no one was forced them to marry anyone. And they became known as the Ladies of Llangollen. They set up a famous artistic and literary retreat in their cottage, and it was visited by the likes of Lord Byron, Shelley and Wordsworth. I think in modern times they're now considered kind of gay icons. Our next stop will be the Hole in the Wall on High Street. It's about 300 metres away, a 4-minute walk. If you walk down the parade towards High Street, walk up High Street until you see the goods department store. On the left side of the street, you'll see a small arch into a lane. Walk through that and you'll come to a courtyard. Stop 14. Hole in the Wall. This is the Hole in the Wall. It was originally the townhouse of the wealthy Archer family. It was built in 1582. It's said to be the oldest surviving townhouse in Ireland. The Archers were one of the powerful merchant families who made up the 10 civic families of Kilkenny that we mentioned earlier. The original name for the building was the Archer Inner House. It's a fantastic example of a late Tudor mansion. Its key feature is its magnificent timber-beamed Great Hall, which has a 2-storey high ceiling and a large stone fireplace. The name Hole in the Wall comes from a later period when the main entrance was blocked up and access was only possible through that narrow hole-like passage that we passed through from the street. And for over 200 years, this architectural gem was completely hidden. The Grand Archer Mansion was absorbed into the surrounding buildings on High Street and then subdivided into smaller rooms and tenements, and its main features were all covered up. The Great Hall was forgotten and it was hidden behind a false wall. But then in the 90s, the property was purchased by Dr. Michael Conway. He was a cardiologist in the local hospital here, St. Luke's. During the restoration work, they broke through the wall and rediscovered the spectacular and perfectly preserved Great Hall. Today, the Hole in the Wall operates as a venue for concerts and events. The pub bit of it is tiny, so sometimes you have to squeeze in between tourists. If you want to break away now and jump in there for a pint before we move on, please go for it, and I can pick back up from there. When you're ready, our next stop will be the courthouse. It's about 350 metres away. It's a 5-minute walk, and that will be our last stop. So walk back onto High Street, turn left and continue down the street for 300 metres until you reach the courthouse on the right hand side of the road. Stop 15. The courthouse. So across the road from here is Roath House, which we mentioned earlier, and it's a real treasure. It was home of the Roath family, the final Big Ten family I'll mention. It has the only original Norman burger plot left in Kilkenny. It was built by a wealthy merchant family, the Roaths, and you can see it's not one house but 3 houses built one behind the other, with courtyards in between, and a long garden stretching all the way back, just as it would have in the 1200s, so it's really well preserved. This building right next to us now is the courthouse. It was originally a townhouse for the powerful Grace family. Later it became a jail, and then it became the courthouse you see today. But for 7 years, from 1642, this building was the centre of power for the entire country. Why 1642? Well, back in England at the time, a civil war was raging between King Charles I and the Parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell. So during the civil war, the Catholic lords of Ireland sided with the king and formed a government of their own in exile right here in Kilkenny, and they called it the Irish Confederacy. The Butler family were staunch royalists, so the Confederate Parliament met here in their backyard. And for a brief time, 7 years or so, Kilkenny was the capital of Ireland. That's why this street is called Parliament Street, because the Parliament was held here. It was during this time that King Charles I granted Kilkenny its official city charter. So that's the real reason we're a city. Not because of the cathedrals, but because we were once the capital, and the Butlers were the king's ride-or-die buddies. Well, you probably know how the English Civil War ended. Cromwell won, and in 1650 he came to Ireland to quash the rebellion here. He laid siege to Kilkenny, bombarded the castle, which is how the back wall got destroyed, and he famously stabled his horses in St. Canice's Cathedral and smashed all its stained glass windows. Oliver Cromwell's 4-year campaign in Ireland was absolutely brutal. His forces massacred thousands of civilians. He laid other cities to siege, including the horrible sieges of Drogheda and Wexford. The campaign was designed to break Irish resistance through absolute terror. We'd probably call it genocide now, but they didn't have that word back then. His devastating legacy was the Cromwellian plantation, which resulted in a massive death toll and the wholesale confiscation of Catholic-owned land, and it was transferred to English soldiers and settlers, and it established a new Protestant ascendancy that would dominate Ireland for centuries. It's estimated that Cromwell wiped out 15 to 20% of the population. So when he laid siege to Kilkenny, what about the Butlers? Did they fight the good fight, defend their castle and the city to the last man? Well, no. They fled to France with the royal family and hid out until the English Parliament decided they wanted to bring the crown back. When the monarchy was restored in England, the Butlers got their castle back. The king even gave them a title upgrade from Marquess to Earl for their loyalty. So that brings our story full circle. Kilkenny started as a small monastic settlement founded by the big man, St. Canice, with the big head. Then Strongbow and the Normans arrive because an Irish king was banished. Strongbow's son-in-law, William Marshall, builds the castle and develops Hightown, and the rival wall towns live side by side. Terrible plague hits the town. Merchant families fight for power. A Machiavellian bishop holds a witch trial and burns a woman at the stake. The Butlers arrive with all their wine tax money. The English Civil War kicks off. Kilkenny becomes a city by royal charter. A rebel parliament is established and Kilkenny is briefly the capital of Ireland, but Cromwell puts an end to that, lays siege to the city and quashes the rebellion. The Butlers return and eventually sell the castle to the people of Kilkenny in the 60s. So Kilkenny has seen a lot, including 36 All-Ireland hurling championships. We're also the best at the traditional Irish sport of hurling. I forgot to mention hurling. It's a pretty big deal around here. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed our walk through the Marble City. Enjoy the rest of your time here. If you need a drink after all that, I recommend Clear's Pub. It's on the left-hand side of the street down towards Canice's Cathedral, back where we started. It has a red facade. If you enjoyed this podcast and you haven't already, please give it a rating on Spotify or Apple, or wherever you're listening to this. This has been a story for yarnpodcast.com, and it's been written and narrated by me, John Roach.